Clark had mentioned that you used to come out to Vancouver quite a lot in... What?
Not quite a lot. At the tender age of 19, a prairie boy who scarcely was aware of the fact that there was evil in the world came out here in the winter of 1958. And I spent the entire winter here, and it was quite an insight for me.
So that was your first exploration of sort of meeting other gay people, or have you met them before?
Oh, I was aware of the fact that other gay people existed, but the paranoia was such that even if you recognized a fellow as gay, the first reaction was avoidance, because it was guilt by association. The whole tenor of the times was analogous, I suppose, to being Jewish in Germany in the 30s. If you could pass as straight, you did. And the people who couldn't pass, you avoided also like the plague, because you were just desperately afraid that you would get outed.
So,
what would have been the consequences of being outed?
I have to go back and fill you in a little bit on the political temper of the times. This has to do with whatever mentality that was that came out of the Second World War. It was supremely ironic that at fantastic cost in life and resources, hundreds of thousands of people went over there to put down the Nazis. And a lot of them came back thinking like Nazis themselves. It was a time of absolute conformity. If you didn't have bristles on the back of your neck, you were considered to be subversive. This was the way it was in terms of the social conventions, and there was to be absolutely no deviation from that whatsoever. There was no tolerance whatsoever for diversity or self-actualization. You fitted in, or else, metaphorically speaking, you would get lined up against the wall and shot. We still have rednecks and bigots and racists among us, but they are now more or less in the minority. In those days, that was the standard.
So if you were caught, what would be the consequences?
Total kind of social ostracization. If you were employed, you would lose your job. You would just be totally shunned. You'd be an outsider.
And what I'm curious about is, what were the signs? How would gay people know each other under these circumstances?
Well, even in those days, there was gay-dar, all right? But in a certain sense, it was a negative thing, you know. Wow. Uh-oh. There's somebody who suspects my guilty secret.
And if you were to meet someone in the street, I mean, if you could just lead me through what two people would do?
I mean, it would be an exchange of I mean, eye contact would be entirely too long for comfort. And in most instances, both parties would just get all flustered and embarrassed and flee the scene. And you people these days have absolutely no idea what that did to people psychologically. In terms of any sex life, the most you could possibly expect was a furtive, anonymous little dalliance in some bushes somewhere. At least in the prairie environment of those small towns. God, you had to be careful. I mean, the air was heavy with paranoia.
So if, would there be certain locations that people would go to?
Oh, yes. In terms of place where, there were always public toilets to be cruised, parks. In Vancouver, it was the first experience I had ever had of the idea that there were actually places where you could go and meet other gay folks. In those days, men and women were segregated in terms of bars. And the place in those days was the men's beer parlor, it was called, in the basement of the Hotel Vancouver. And I remember this clearly. There was a corner beside a fireplace, and sitting in that corner holding court were about half a dozen, I mean really effeminate Nelly queens. And they were the arbiters. If you got in, if they liked you, then you had a possibility of getting invited to house parties and that sort of thing. But if you ever crossed one, God help you, they had wits and tongues as sharp and quick as snake bite. And if one of them ever went to town on you, but before they were finished with you, you were just praying that the ground would open up and swallow you. Now, in retrospect, everybody crossed the street when they saw one of these Nelly queens coming because of the, you know, you were just petrified that you were going to get screamed at in the street, and it would have been just too embarrassing to cope with. But in retrospect, they were tough old queens. They had to be. And as I said, in retrospect, we should have really respected them because, boy, they were taking the heat for everybody else. The other places I remember is there was another kind of a nightclub called The Castle. And there was another place, it was a White Spot restaurant, which I remember being at that time on Granville Street. And that was the after hours. That was very cruisy after midnight, and I seem to remember that it stayed open, you know, into the wee hours of the morning. There were relationships. There were men living together in permanent relationships even in those days, but in order to do that, boy, you had to be careful because, I mean, it didn't take much to generate suspicion. Out here in Vancouver, it was a little bit more tolerant and laid back, but in a prairie town, such a thing was absolutely unheard of.
So in a sense, when you came at 19, that was your first sexual awakening in Vancouver, or that was just the first?
Oh, no, I was aware of where I was at sexually at a very early age. From the time I was about 13, I was aware of being very, very different, but not knowing precisely why or how.